Hello there, welcome back to my story tent. I'm here to tell you another set of stories. Now the first story I'm going to tell you today comes from the West. Previously I've been telling you stories from the North. Today's stories come from a land which is full of mountains, great big mountains. And around the mountains you will find a forest. The forest is all around the bottom of all the mountains. Now today's story is all about three huge, great, big giants. But before we get to the giants, in the forest at the bottom of the mountains, there lives a little girl. Now she lives in a tree house. What's a good name for a little girl that would live in a tree house? Let me think. Her name was Nesta. Nesta lived in the tree house in the forest at the bottom of the mountains, and she was quite happy in her forest home. She lived there with a very good friend of hers. Now, she wanted a pet when she was younger, and she really wanted a dog. But you can't have a dog in a tree house, because when they fall out, they're very difficult to get back in again. And also, we all know what dogs do on trees. So she had to think of another pet. What pet do you think would be good in a tree house? She had a pet squirrel. Now the pet squirrel was called Rex because she always wanted a dog. Now Squirrel Rex loved one thing. Squirrel Rex lived for one thing. He loved walnuts. He would jump around the forest from tree to tree, snuffling around in the undergrowth, going through all the leaves, trying to find walnuts. He loved walnuts. If he could, he'd have walnuts for every single meal. He'd have walnut pizza, he'd have walnut ice cream, walnut fish fingers. He would have walnut omelette. He had steak and walnut. He had vegetarian walnut casserole. He had all sorts of dishes made of walnuts. He loved walnuts. Now one day, Squirrel Rex was jumping around the forest looking for walnuts when he heard a very strange sound. To describe that sound, we're going back to the mountains. In the mountains, there was a huge valley, and in the huge valley there was a huge house, and in the huge house there lived three huge giants. Now the three giants were called Rob, Bob and Jeff. Now Rob, Bob and Jeff, they lived together because they had some very peculiar habits. Rob, he liked to eat. He would eat all day long. He would have 32 breakfasts. He would have 54 lunches. He would have at least 18 dinners. And then at night, he'd have at least 44 suppers. And when he wasn't eating, he'd be having snacks. But when he ate with his mouth open. Ugh. He would shovel food in like there was no tomorrow. And when he did, he would make a horrible sound when he ate. It would go like this. Chop 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 chop. Oh, chop 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 chop. Chop 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 chop. The sound was so loud it echoed all around the mountains. Jeff liked to sleep. Jeff would be asleep for 23 hours a day, and when he wasn't asleep, he'd be having a nap. But when he slept with his mouth open. What sort of noise do you think he made? You're absolutely right. The noise he made went a bit like this. Oh, it was so loud, it echoed all around the mountains. And Bob liked to talk. Bob would talk to everyone and everything. When he woke up in the morning, he would talk to his pillow. Blah, 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 blah. Then he'd talk to his pyjamas when he'd taken them off. Blah, 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 blah. Then he would talk to his toothbrush. Blah, 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 blah. And the toothpaste, blah, 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 blah. And the sink, blah, 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 blah. And the soap, blah, 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 blah. And it went on and on and on and on. And it was so loud, it echoed all around the mountain. So the noise that Squirrel Rex heard when he was leaping through the trees looking for his walnuts went a bit like this. It went chomp, 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 chomp. Blah, 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 blah. And Squirrel Rex thought, what on earth is that? What an incredibly strange noise. I wonder what it is. I'm going to go investigate. So Squirrel Rex jumped through the forest, followed the sound into the mountains, went through the mountains until he found a huge valley. And when he found the huge valley, he found the huge house. And he noticed that the huge house had a huge gap under the huge front door. So Squirrel Rex crept in. He went through the huge hallway and he looked around at the huge hat stand. He looked around at the huge pictures and the huge telephone, and he went through the hallway past the huge sitting room, which had a huge sofa and a huge television. And he got to the kitchen, and when he looked in the kitchen, he saw 3 huge giants. Now, one of them was eating his 25th breakfast. Chomp, 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 chomp. The second one was asleep in his breakfast, and as he snored into his breakfast, he blew bubbles in the beans, and he had a sausage sticking out one ear. And the third giant was talking to the kettle. Blah, 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 blah. But Squirrel Rex looked around, and on the sideboard he saw a huge, big bowl of walnuts. Giant walnuts. Squirrel Rex said, my word, look at those walnuts. If I had just one of those walnuts, I would be able to eat that all week long. I am going to get me one of them walnuts. And he crept into the kitchen, and he jumped onto a chair, and he jumped onto the table, and he ran behind the salt and pepper pot, and he got to the edge of the table, and he looked at the bowl, and he jumped, and he landed on the edge of the bowl, and it tipped the bowl up. Walnuts flew everywhere, all around the kitchen. The 3 giants, they were getting on with their business, but the first giant, who was now eating his 33rd breakfast, chomp, 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 was eating it with his mouth open, and a walnut flew right into his mouth. Chomp, 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 chomp. And he pulled it out. Oh, it was a walnut, he said. And he looked at the walnut bowl, and he saw Squirrel Rex. He said to himself, ooh, look at that squirrel. Now, if I captured that squirrel, I could feed it up with lots of walnuts until it was nice and fat, and it would make a lovely snack. The second giant was still asleep in his breakfast, and he was still blowing bubbles in his beans. And a walnut flew right into his mouth. It's a walnut. And he looked at the walnut bowl. Ooh. And he saw Squirrel Rex. And he thought to himself, ooh, if I could capture that squirrel, I could comb and brush its hair until it was nice and soft. And then I could stuff it, and it would make a lovely pillow. The third giant, by this time, was talking to the coffee pot and to the spoon. Blah 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 blah. And as he did, a walnut flew into his mouth. Blah 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 blah. bowl and he saw Squirrel Rex. And he said to himself, "Ooh," he said, "if I could capture that squirrel, I could lock him in a cage, and I could talk to that squirrel all day long, forever and ever and ever and ever." The three giants all started to walk towards the walnut bowl. Boom, boom, boom. Squirrel Rex, who was perched on the side of the walnut bowl, saw the three giants and he squeaked, "Eek!" And he thought to himself, "I've got to get out, I've got to escape." And so he started to run. He jumped on top of the fridge and a giant jumped after him. And as the giant landed on top of the fridge, he found a cake he'd put up there 3 months ago and he went, "Ooh, cake!" Chomp, 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 chomp. The second giant, he chased after Squirrel Rex, and Squirrel Rex ran across the top of the sofa in the kitchen, and the giant leapt after him. Ah! And as soon as he landed on the sofa, he fell asleep. Ah! But the third giant had been talking to himself about a plan. Blah, 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 blah. Hat. Blah, 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 blah. Squirrel. Blah, 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 blah. Capture. And he took off his hat, and he threw his hat over Squirrel Rex, and it landed right over him. The third giant put his hand underneath the hat, pulled out Squirrel Rex, and he went to a cage, a little bird cage in the corner of the kitchen, unlocked the door, put Squirrel Rex in, and locked the door. Squirrel Rex was captured. Down in the forest, Nesta had been wondering where Squirrel Rex was. She'd already called him for breakfast, and he hadn't appeared. She was now looking for him for elevenses, and he still hadn't appeared. "I wonder where Squirrel Rex is. He never misses breakfast, and he never misses elevenses. We had walnut porridge for breakfast, and now we got walnut biscuits for elevenses. I wonder where Squirrel Rex is." She started to search for him, calling out his name, "Rex, Rex, Rex, Rex," all round the forest, but didn't get an answer. She searched the whole forest, and then she went back to her treehouse. She thought, "I wonder where he is." And then she heard a noise. It went chomp, 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 blah, 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 blah. She thought, "I wonder what that is. What a strange noise. It's so loud. It's coming from the mountains. I bet Squirrel Rex has gone to investigate. I better go and find him." So she took her little sword and a bag, and she walked out of the forest into the mountains. She followed the sound until she got to the valley, the huge big valley. And in the huge big valley she found the huge big house. And in the huge big house she found the huge big front door. And she saw that underneath the front door there was a huge great big gap. So she slithered under. She went through the huge great hallway, and she saw the huge great hat stand and the huge great pictures on the wall. And she went past the sitting room, and she saw the huge great sofas and the huge great TV. She got to the kitchen, and she looked in the kitchen, and she saw 3 huge big giants. One was now having his elevenses, and he was having his 85th biscuit. And she saw the second giant, who was now asleep on the sofa. And she saw the third giant, who was talking to the vacuum cleaner. Blah, 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 blah. But then she saw in the corner of the kitchen, in a cage, Squirrel Rex. She thought, "He's got himself captured. Oh, Squirrel Rex, how am I going to save you?" And she thought a while, and then she thought of a plan. On the table there were 3 giant wooden beer mugs. She looked around. The giants were busy. She climbed onto the chair, she climbed onto the table, she ran behind the salt and pepper pot, and she waited. When the giants weren't looking or were asleep, she crept out from behind the salt and pepper pot, And she went to the first mug, and she climbed up, and she climbed in, and she hid and waited. After half an hour, the first giant said, "Oh," he said, "isn't it time for lunch time yet? He said, it seems so long from breakfast, and I've only had a little bit of 11s. He said, isn't it lunch time?" And the second giant woke up on the sofa and said, "Oh, I suppose so. Someone else can make it. I'm just exhausted." And the third giant said, "Yes, lunch. I've been planning lunch all morning. Blah, 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 blah. I have a plan. We'll have lunch now." And they started to prepare lunch. As they prepared lunch, Nesta hid in the first giant beer mug, and eventually one of the giants poured beer into all the beer mugs. Nesta, she swam and she trod water, or beer, just until she could float with her head above, and she waited. The first giant, after a while, he was eating his 18th lunch, and he said, "Oh," he said, "all that eating lunch, chomp, 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 made me a little bit thirsty." He said, "I think I'll have some beer to wash it down." And he picked up the first giant beer mug, and he took a great giant mouthful, and into his mouth swam Nesta. She held on to his tongue. The giant swallowed the beer, but Nesta, she waited. She let go of his tongue, and she went over to his teeth, and with her little sword she poked him right in the gums. Poke, 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 poke. And the giant, he started to eat again. "Oh, chomp, 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 ouch, chomp, 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 ouch, chomp, chomp, ouch, chomp, ouch, chomp, ouch, chomp, ouch, chomp, ow, ow, ow." He said, "Every time I eat, it hurts. Oh, I don't think I want to eat anymore." And as he said the word "more," Nesta jumped out of his mouth into the second beer pot, and she hid. The second giant was asleep in his lunch. He had a chip sticking out of his ear, he had 2 sausages up his nose, and he was blowing bubbles in the gravy. He woke up. "Oh, I'm so tired. I think I need some beer." And so he picked up his beer mug, and he took a big mouthful of beer, and into his mouth swam Nesta, and she held on to his tongue. "Oh, said the giant. "Oh, that's better. I think I need a nap after I'm exhausted." And he started to sleep. Nesta let go of his tongue, and she went to that dangly bit at the back of your throat, which is called an uvula. There you go. There's an education. She held on to his little uvula, dangling at the back of his throat, and it wobbled as he snored, and she poked it with her sword. Poke, 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 poke. And the giant snored on. "Ouch! Ouch! 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 Ow!" And he woke up. He said, "Oh," he said, "when I sleep it hurts. I don't think I want to sleep anymore." And as he said the word "more," Nesta jumped out of his mouth into the third giant beer pot. The third giant, he was talking to his knife, he was talking to his fork, blah, 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 blah. He was talking to the sausages, blah, 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 blah. He was talking to the chips, blah, 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 blah. He was talking to the gravy, blah, 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 blah. He was talking to the tomato ketchup, blah, 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 blah. After a while, he said, "Oh, all this talking has made me a bit thirsty. I'll have some beer." And he took a big mouthful of his beer, and into his mouth swam Nesta, and she held on to his tongue. He put down his beer pot, and he said, "Oh, do you know what? I haven't spoken to the peas yet." Blah, 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 blah. And as he did, Nesta took her little sword, and she poked him in the tongue. Poke, 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 poke. Blah, 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 ouch, blah, blah, ouch, blah, ouch, blah, ouch, blah, ouch, blah, ouch, ouch, ouch. He said, "Oh, it hurts. Every time I talk, ouch, it hurts. I don't think I want to talk anymore." And as he said the word "more," Nesta jumped out of his mouth and hid behind the salt and pepper pot. The 3 giants sat at the table. The first one said, "I don't think I want to eat anymore. It hurts. I don't need that squirrel." The second one said, "I don't want to sleep anymore. It hurts. I don't want that squirrel." And the third one didn't say anything because it hurt. He just looked at the squirrel and said, "Mm-hmm." And so they went to the cage, they opened the cage, and they let him go. Squirrel Rex jumped out of the cage, off the table, off the chair, through the giant hallway, under the giant door, and all the way through the giant valley, down to the giant forest, and hid in the treehouse. Nesta waited until he'd escaped, and then she too left the giant house. She went back to her tree house, and when she got there she found Squirrel Rex, and she told him, "You should never go into strange people's houses. You don't know what you might find, especially giants." And they lived quite happily in the forest in their tree house. Because now if you go to the west, you will find a land of mountains and a forest, and if you go into the mountains, it's lovely and peaceful and quiet. But it doesn't mean to say there aren't giants still living there. And that is the story of the 3 giants. I will come back. I will tell you some more stories from the West. In the meantime, if you want to visit www.markfraser-storyteller, it's not a hash, it's a dash, storyteller.com, you will find my books with some of these stories in them. If you'd like to order, please do, and I can send them out to you. I will be back, and I will be back with more stories next time, from the story tent to you. And remember, tomorrow is another story. Goodbye.